It's a phenomenon that happens right here on our streets, and we don't realize it.
Underlying all of this is a pervasive culture that degrades people and rates them based on their gender and their race.
From firsthand undercover police officer testimony, there is prostitution that happens in every single strip club in Fort Worth city limits.
There's a variety of people who are engaged in purchasing commercial sex, and they don't always look like the dirty old man that you think of when you think of someone who would try to engage a child for sexual services.
As long as there is a demand of men who are willing to pay for these women, there's going to be a supply of women.
You're actually selling your soul to somebody else who's going to sell your body for financial gains, that they keep all the profits, and all that young person gets is abuse, emotional, sexual abuse, physical abuse, drug addiction at the end of the day.
The more stories you hear, the more you understand how someone could get trapped in this and feel like there's no way out.
Well, my name is Tommy Grover. It's Tomigrover, and I have a PhD in social work and ministry-based evangelism, and so I work at the issue of human trafficking from a big picture macro practice social work vantage point.
Vanessa Boucher, and I'm an assistant professor of political science at TCU. I developed this class because I am passionate about this issue of human trafficking, and this is where my research agenda has taken me, and so it was a natural fit to teach a class on what I'm researching as well as what I care passionately about.
I'm George Lynch, and I'm the CEO of Traffic 911. So Traffic 911 is a non-governmental organization that works in freeing youth from sex trafficking, and our focus is young people from the ages of 12 to 17. And we work along prevention, identification, and then empowerment.
My name is Stephanie Bird, and I'm Executive Director of Unbound Fort Worth. Unbound's mission is to mobilize the church and activate local communities to fight human trafficking through prevention, professional training, and survivor advocacy.
My name is Ty Bowden. I am the MACE director at the net. MACE stands for Men Against Sexual Exploitation. So it's kind of our guys' side of what we call our purchase program. And so purchase is just an initiative to fight against sex trafficking, sexual exploitation, specifically here in Fort Worth.
I've been doing this work since about 2006, 2007, when there was very little going on in the movement per se. It was just at its genesis point for a lot of folks after the Trafficking Victims Protection Act came out in 2000.
I had the privilege of working in the travel industry for a number of years. The CEO of the company Sabre that I worked for was compelled by another leader at a hotel company who just said, you know what, here in the travel industry, it's our industry is sort of this unwitting player to this evil industry of selling people. Mm-hmm. So there began this early groundswell, and this goes back 2009, 10, for organizations in the travel industry to train their frontline employees on how to see something, then say something.
I was a history major as an undergrad, and I specifically focused on American history, and I took classes on the slave trade in the United States and the abolition movement. But one of the things that I always thought to myself, what if I had lived then? Would I have been an abolitionist?
When I was in college, I had an opportunity to travel to Cambodia a couple of different times. And so during my summers there, I saw women and children, a lot of children, being overtly sold on the streets to sex tourists. And it made me mad. And it made me mad not necessarily for all the right reasons, but I knew that I had to do something to stop it.
I attended a conference on Wilberforce and met a woman whose husband was the first attorney who worked for IJM. And she was telling me about the work they did. And I wanted very much to be involved at that time, but it just wasn't the right season for me to do that. And most of the work was being done overseas in other countries.
Everything that I was upset about women and kids being sold overseas is actually happening in the city where I lived, where I went to school, where I grew up. I still am passionate about the women and children in Cambodia, and there's great work going on there. But this is where I'm from, this is where I live, this is where I have roots, and so I decided to try to fight it here in Fort Worth.
It was the first question I asked when I got involved in this issue here in Fort Worth. I said, are we sure it's happening here? Because at that time, I couldn't pull up a lot of news stories. There was a case or two here or there, but is this really a widespread, ongoing thing here in Fort Worth?
I'm a father. I have a 22-year-old daughter, a 20-year-old son, married, 2 older sisters. I couldn't imagine that people were taking advantage of young people in particular. And so that it kind of stirred my heart, and so I sort of put aside my marketing career to say I'd rather be in the life transformation business.
You can go and see for yourself. You don't have to just take it as someone's word, or just because an organization is saying that trafficking is happening and they're trying to raise funds and you wonder, is this really happening or not? You can research it and find out for yourself.
One of the things that happened here in Fort Worth is that they were a part of a federal grant for some of the initial task force coalition development that happened way back in those early days of the mid-2000s. And from that, they had some trainings and things that were done for local community organizing groups, as well as the law enforcement community, and they started to see things that they hadn't seen before, and they started to do education, and the community started to really wrap its mind around what was happening here and what that might look like for them to respond to it. There was a study that was done by Shared Hope International, which is led by Linda Smith, who's a former U.S. representative out of the state of Washington. And they chose 10 cities across the country in the 2004-2005 timeframe, and 3 of those were in Texas. 2 of them were Dallas and Fort Worth, and the 3rd one was San Antonio. Well, you might wonder why Fort Worth and Dallas, being so physically close to one another in proximity, they were worlds apart in the way that they had demonstrated that they were going to be taking care of this issue, or looking at this issue from a law enforcement perspective, or what it might look like locally. And so the study came out, and there was some specific recommendations that were given to the Fort Worth community and its leadership, and they did find that trafficking of minors is happening in all 50 states. One of the things that they focused their efforts on was developing a response in those local communities to the problem, specifically to domestic minor sex trafficking, not human trafficking in general, which it would include the labor part of it, nor did they focus tremendous amount of time on the adult prostitution industry in those communities, but they really were looking specifically at domestic minor sex trafficking.
Most attention has been paid to domestic minor sex trafficking. And when you say domestic, typically speaking, people think American. They don't think domestic in the sense that it's sex trafficking that's happening in the United States, as in sex trafficking happening domestically, right? They're thinking domestic minor sex trafficking. So American minors being trafficked for sex. And that is what creates the most moral panic and outrage among the American public. So that's why I think that's where most of the attention has been paid. And that absolutely bears out in our public opinion data that we found. We find that yes, when it's a minor, people are outraged way more than when it's an adult. And this is hugely problematic because adult victims of sex trafficking and even adult women in prostitution are most of them, the vast majority, started in the life when they were minors, so when they were 14 or 15.
We knew that runaway and homeless youth were participating in survival sex, is what they call it. but we had no idea just how big the problem was of children being bought and sold on an everyday basis in local community. They also went a step further with that and made some recommendations for legislative actions that would change state laws to meet what the federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act was designed to do.
So according to federal law, sex trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, soliciting, or patronizing a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act when that act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or the person induced to commit such an act has not yet attained the age of 18. If it's an adult, someone 18 or older, force, fraud, or coercion has to be present for it to be trafficking. If it is someone 17 years or younger, then we do not have to show force, fraud, or coercion. It is sufficient that they are a minor, they cannot consent to that, and it is sex trafficking.
So this is one of the more controversial things, because I think a lot of guys understand and believe that buying and selling human beings is bad. There's just kind of direct comparisons there to antebellum slavery, and so most people would say that buying a woman is a bad thing. Where a lot of guys have a disconnect is when it comes to pornography, because pornography is something that is actually becoming more and more culturally acceptable. It's not as taboo now.
Pornography continues to play an incredible role in understanding the demand factor and the lucrative nature of selling children, especially because the demand for children engaged in images of pornography, which to me is the rape and torture of children on video or in pictures.
There are two main ways that pornography drives the demand for sex trafficking, commercial sex, whatever you want to call it. And the first one is just directly, if you look at the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is how the federal government defines sex trafficking, the harboring, transporting, or recruiting of a woman for a commercial sex act is considered sex trafficking. And that's what pornography does. It harbors, recruits, and transports women to perform sex acts in front of a camera. And somehow our society has decided that putting a camera on it makes it a freedom of speech act, which I don't understand, because literally, legally, under the federal law, pornography is sex trafficking.
We have an or I should say a neuroscience training on pornography and how it interacts into this game of trafficking, how it breeds demand in young people and adults' minds that ultimately says, I want to buy somebody to fulfill the fantasy I've watched online for hours.
And secondly, which is more discreet, harder to track, but arguably more damaging, is pornography rewires a man's brain to see a woman as an object, to see women as objects to fulfill their sexual pleasures. And so as you consume more and more pornography, you require more violent, more racist, more misogynistic sex acts to achieve that same level of high, much like consuming drugs. And so men are forced to consume more and more and more pornography until eventually the pornography is not good enough, and so you take it to your wife or your girlfriend or another regular sex partner, and because pornography has twisted your views, they're not willing to act out those sexual desires with you because they're deviant at this point. And so the only other avenue for which a man can act out those sexual fantasies is to go buy a woman off the street. As those pathways in your brain are deepened and deepened and reinforced, it forces you to search elsewhere to have those things fulfilled, and ultimately that's going to end up with you on one of those websites buying a woman, because when you pay for it, she has to do what you say. So consuming pornography directly contributes to the sex industry, whether you want to think about that or not.
Our now governor, Greg Abbott, has started the child sex trafficking team at the governor's office. They work with the OAG's office to try and implement some specific initiatives that focus on child sex trafficking to make Texas hostile territory, to really make it one one of those areas where we see the needs and we focus on it, much like a public health issue. And when you have a public health issue, of course, you've got to have prevention.
What MACE does is we educate, equip, and engage with men in Fort Worth who don't buy sex. We train them up to engage with men who do buy sex. So we're trying to make it, one, an unsafe place to buy sex. We want to disrupt men at the point of sale here in Fort Worth. And so we do that a couple of different ways. The main way we do online disruptions, where we actually speak to men who are attempting to buy sex. And so we want to remove that anonymity. We want to create a culture where it's not worth the risk because you're going to get caught. Just like everything else in the world, buying things is moving online. And so whereas even 5 or 6 years ago, you would have seen a lot of street prostitution in the poorer areas of Fort Worth, that has gone online. And there are a couple of select websites that you can just kind of consider the Craigslist for sex. Ads will be posted about these women with pictures of them dressed in scanty clothing, if anything at all. Just like with Craigslist, you text or call the ad and you talk about what you want, you come to an agreement, and then you meet up. On Craigslist, you buy a piece of furniture. That's literally exactly what it's like.
Right now, the most likely place to buy a child is online. And you can actually go online and purchase a couch or a kid, and you can go back and rate the services that you got in some of the websites.
Through a couple of partner organizations have come up with a program to target the men who are calling for sex on these online ads. And so when they call, instead of speaking to a woman, they get one of our guy volunteers, which is a big shock for most of them. And we kind of run them through maybe a 2-minute phone call that, like I said earlier, just kind of opens their eyes to the reality of what these women are facing. Letting them know that these women are not there by choice, that their whole lives have been trauma and abuse and exploitation that have led them to be sold on these websites.
The net has become great friends of Traffic 911 just through personal connections, and then actually saying, hey, you guys are doing innovative things in Fort Worth. Are there ways I could be a part of some of that learning and being a part of that? And so I joined the Men Against Sexual Exploitation team, of part of the net, and worked with the team to learn about the cyber patrol activities and the opportunity to help really equip men, maybe women, who are making a call to a decoy ad, and have the opportunity for them right at the point of purchase to get a wake-up call.
And it's really cool because we get them right at the moment that they've decided to purchase sex, and so they're in an extremely vulnerable place. We get our fair shares of hang-ups and angry responses, you could say, but we also get a good percentage of men who really want to change, who have their eyes opened and are willing to kind of look at their lives and reassess what's going on. And so we really think that we are making a dent in it, and it's going to be a multiple year, decade long battle before the culture change that I talked about earlier is going to happen. We just let them in on that reality, and then also explain them the legal penalties, because unfortunately some guys don't really care about what the woman is experiencing. And then we also offer to get them help with anonymous resources if they have a sex or a love addiction, or if they just need counseling, things like that. We offer to point them in those directions.
It still amazes me, even today, after being in this work 11 years, that people really don't know that they don't know what's happening right here in their local community.
One of the quotes from my course evaluations was, the only bad thing about this class is that it can't be taught to more students. So I think that sort of encapsulates, the way students feel about what they're learning. They feel almost, and some have expressed to me that they feel almost cheated, that it's taken them to become, 20 years old to hear about this. And that's outrageous, that it shouldn't have taken 20 years of their lives for them to first hear that this is still going on in the world today. We do our own sort of reverse sting, if you will, where we set up a fake ad on Backpage, and then we set up the ad at approximately 3 p.m. and by 7 p.m. my students go to Panera on University Drive, and we tell the people that call to show up at the Hawthorne Suites across the street from Panera. And the students essentially observe the men that arrive. The people that call or text, my female students have the opportunity to actually talk to them on the phone. And they have the opportunity to read some of the texts that come through and see how incredibly graphic these texts are that the men are sending to these women. And we oftentimes ask or request the men who show up to do things that I think would be considered outrageous by the general public, just to show and demonstrate how far these individuals are willing to go to get inside that door to have sex with that individual. We've told them that the fake person that they're buying is coming down off of a high and needs some caffeine. Well, they walk across the street and get a cup of coffee, and they do it. And they do it willingly. It just not only demonstrates what they're willing to do, but also that they really don't care about the well-being of the victim. They don't care that this individual was clearly demonstrating that they were strung out on drugs and they need a cup of coffee, and they're willing to give them that cup of coffee as long as they can have sex with them. It doesn't matter that they have a drug problem. We've also asked them at various times to lift up their shirts to show that they don't have a wire on them, because we want to make sure that they're not a cop, and they will, like, right on broad daylight, University Drive, lift up their shirts. One of them pulled in with a boat in tow, and we asked him to jump into his boat and start waving his hands around just to make sure that we had the right person, that we were watching the right person, and sure enough, he did it. We've asked them to do cartwheels, and they've done cartwheels. One time we told them that our child was with us and we weren't quite sure what to do, and they said that's okay, they can stay. The stories go on and on and on of what the men are willing to do in order to get in that door without regard for the well-being of the individual on the other side of that door. They observe the sheer volume of individuals that respond to the one ad that we put on Backpage. Between 3 p.m. and the time that we go to observe this on the street at 7 p.m., there are on average of 1 call or text per minute during that period of time. And then in a short 2-hour time span that we are sitting there observing this, about 9 people show up in 2 hours. The sheer volume of demand for commercial sex that the students get to see as a result of that experience shocks them, it floors them, and it disgusts them that it's right down the street from their university. If our person that we posted was a real human being, in 2 hours' time, she could have had sex with 9 people. That's outrageous, and that's really a human rights violation, quite frankly.
Prevention and awareness is critical. If we can prevent just one person from falling prey to a trafficker, that is a huge win. I think we've seen huge strides in awareness in our community. Not just Unbound, but lots of other organizations have been conducting trainings, presentations all over Fort Worth and in all different spheres, churches, businesses, medical profession, legal profession. And so I think awareness is rising, which is a very good thing.
You know, every year we speak to thousands. Last year we spoke to about 14,000 individuals, just training them on the issue. And about 2,000 of those were first responders. And those are the folks that really can multiply. School teachers and counselors can be that front line. If they see something, they can say something. And a lot of times it's a call to us or law enforcement to say, hey, we have a young person I'm concerned about. How can we help them get out of a tough situation? Or we're working with police officers and emergency room physicians and ER doctors and nurses and places where young people might come for services. And if they're equipped, these first responders, to understand, okay, I'm seeing enough signs here, this might be a young person who's actually being trafficked, and begin the process then to get them into a safe place. Cook's Children's Hospital is a great example in Fort Worth. We did a training there probably 5 years ago, and all at once that opened eyes to all of these folks that are working with pediatric young people coming into an ER, and great caregivers there all at once said, hey, we have another one, we have another one. In the most recent case, a buyer delivered a young person who had been intravenously injected with drugs, but they had not gotten it into a blood vessel. Her muscle tissue had become infected because they weren't administering her drug correctly. And the buyer was concerned enough that this person was in dire straits. So glad that he did take her to a place where she could get some medical care, and it began the opportunity for her to become taken out of a very dangerous situation. We're part of conversations with lots of other providers and government agencies here in the state going, how do we put together a continuum of care to really make sure these young people get the best chances that maybe you and I got by winning the zip code lottery and ended up where we ended up in families that made sure that we got educated and saw lots of opportunities. We recognize every one of us was created for a purpose, and we want to see them have the chance to become fully developing citizens and contribute back to society like we get to.
The URL for the database is humantraffickingdata.org, and it was initially funded by a Department of Justice grant. And what it is we're essentially collecting the universe, if possible, of federal human trafficking cases. So cases that have been prosecuted at the federal level on human trafficking, and not necessarily under the TVPA or the trafficking statutes. It could potentially be a trafficking case, but that was prosecuted for something other than trafficking, but that is clearly has trafficking elements in it. What we have so far is a universe of about 900 cases that have been prosecuted across the country, and we are coding for a lot of different information that we are culling from the case files as well as from any media reports that have been written about the cases. Part of the analysis that we are able to do and will continue to be able to do is some geospatial analysis, looking at, for example, in the international cases, where are the victims coming from, and then what states are they going to? So do we see a disproportionate number of victims from, say, the Philippines going to, say, Virginia, than, for example, the Philippines to Texas? And then asking, okay, why is that? So if we see that pattern across many, many cases, there might be some kind of network analysis going on. In other words, there might be a network that is bringing people from the Philippines to Virginia more so than to Texas. We also are able to examine who are the criminals in these cases, who are the individuals that are being prosecuted for trafficking, what is on average is the age, what on average is the gender, what on average is the race, what on average is the nationality, and how do those things vary by the type of trafficking that they're engaging in. And the data is bearing out that yes, there are major differences there, and that you can start to see patterns of behavior across different demographics. I also lead a study abroad on human trafficking in India. And the first time that I led this was in 2014, and it was at that time that we began partnering with Shakti Vahini.
We work on the issue of human trafficking. Our work includes a lot of these rescue operations, working with victims of trafficking, working with law enforcement, and also we do a lot of work on prevention and research also.
Shakti Vahini is one of the most effective organizations across all of India doing this work on sex trafficking, and it's really, really tough work. It's tough work everywhere, but it's particularly tough work in India. And we were so blessed and moved by their work and the way that they execute it that I just felt like I really needed to continue to cultivate this relationship more deeply. Then the Discovering Global Citizenship has initiative at TCU has a component called Global Innovator, and every year they pick a different Global Innovator from a specific region of the globe, and this year the Global Innovator needed to be from South Asia. And so I submitted a proposal, and what the proposal was to work with Ravi Kant and Shakti Bahini in creating a database, an open source searchable database of human trafficking cases that have been prosecuted in India.
And here I am at the TCU to undertake research on the databases and build a database website for India on human trafficking cases.
We've been working really hard the past 2 days to determine exactly how we're going to go about doing this work and creating the database. But it's going to essentially be identical to the database that we've created in the United States.
Many issues here in the United States and in India, since we are both democracies, are almost similar. Cases of trafficking, the types of trafficking, the various dynamics of trafficking, the way the traffickers are operating.
The exciting thing about this project is that it is the first database of human trafficking cases in both the United States and India that has a web application that allows anybody from the public to go and search for specific types of cases that they want.
I think national level data will be very helpful to advocate with the government, because many a times in absence of data people tend to take it lightly, or the lawmakers may ignore it. We are in the midst of getting a comprehensive legislation on human trafficking, and it is this point that such data is important, and lawmakers need to know as to how we are responding to such grave crimes.
It's a complicated issue that doesn't have a one-size-fits-all answer, but it's going to take everybody doing something and they're part of it in concert with one another. And I think that's what I've seen in Fort Worth.
We want to change the boys will be boys culture into something that's more men will be men, because boys take and boys put themselves before others, but men give and men lay down their lives for other people.
We believe there's hope for an end to human trafficking. Restoration is possible for victims and for traffickers and consumers as well.
Our state has been leading the charge at really making headway on those websites like Backpage.com to get that type of services off of their website.
Because here you have sort of the worst of humanity doing this to people, and yet you find the very best of humanity. And God has been gracious just to show me, for every jerk that's doing something horrible to somebody, I'm seeing 10 looking to raise somebody up.
Here in Fort Worth, I would just challenge men to be better men, to engage the men around you, to not let that boys will be boys culture slide, and to not contribute directly or indirectly to the sex industry.
As prevention, intervention, education, and restoration as a public health framework, so that we can begin to understand the comprehensive nature of what needs to happen in order to address trafficking. Because any one of those left out means that there's a vacuum, a void, a vortex, if you will, that people can still swirl in and get sucked into it pretty easily.
MACE wants to bring all that together to where slowly, over time, Fort Worth is a place where women are just not objectified and where they are not bought and sold for sex.
There's been a real core group of people who have really gravitated to this issue and want to do really good work at cooperating with one another and addressing it so that we have fewer victims of child sex trafficking.
This one issue is emblematic of the racism and sexism that still exists in our society today. All you need to do is read one case from humantraffickingdata.org to see that underlying all of this is a pervasive culture that degrades people and rates them based on their gender and their race. And I think that that is antithetical to the heart of God, first and foremost. And I think that as civilized human beings who love people and human rights and believe that every single individual is created in the image of God and is equal before Him and before the law, supposedly, in our society, we ought to do something about that. When we realize what is happening and we do nothing, we become the problem.
Lord, won't you come? Lord,